Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from today. We want to thank you for joining this TechStrong learning experience with Fastly. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. This session is going to be recorded. It will be available afterward on demand, and we will send you a link to the recording after we conclude. Just to let you guys know, we do have some great resources or handouts in the resource section on the left side of your screen. If you guys want to check that out, make sure you download those anytime throughout the presentation. You can have those for you as long as you need them. We also have the Q&A section on the right side of your screen. You can ask any of your questions that you've got throughout this presentation. Anything that you want to know more about, make sure that those get put in there. And any questions that we're not able to answer throughout the session, we want to make sure that we have those in there as well so that we can follow up with you after this program concludes. We've also got the chat on the right side of your screen. We want to hear where you're tuning in from. We want you to share your experiences, your comments, your understanding on the matter. We want to engage with you. We want to keep this presentation lively. So anything that you want to talk about, make sure it goes in the chat. Let's go ahead and kick off today's topic. We've got why Shift Left failed and what to do instead. We're joined with Kelly Shortridge, VP Security Management at Fastly, Lorraine Bellin, Senior Security Specialist at Fastly, Anna Jensen, Technical Product Manager at Fastly. Everyone, if you guys want to go ahead and take it away from here, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn my camera and microphone off.
All right, thank you so much, and thanks for the introduction. My name is Lorraine Bellin. I have a background in application security, network security, and cloud, along with privacy and data governance. I'm currently with Fastly, based in San Francisco, and I'm so excited to be here today with two of my really esteemed colleagues from within the Fastly security organization. I'm going to pass it over to Anna so she can introduce herself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lorraine, for getting into it. I'm Anna. I'm a technical product manager here at Fastly, where I mostly focus on API security and the overall platform engineering experience. Previous to that, I worked at a startup where I was a developer, a manager, utility player, a little bit of everything from application development to building an internal development platform. Aside from that, I've also taught programming languages, writing, and public speaking. So I really enjoyed my teaching experience as well, and I hope to bring that to the product work that I do. And as a fun fact, I am a retired pub trivia host, and outside of software engineering, that is probably the thing I'm most opinionated about. So I'll pass it over to Kelly.
Looks like Kelly's having some technical difficulties. While we wait for her to come back, I can share a fun fact too. I'm actually a trained yoga and meditation teacher. A lot of people don't know that about me. It comes in handy a lot more than you might expect working in security and just working in tech in general, having the patience and ability to take a deep breath. So highly recommend anyone who works in tech, take some yoga classes. It'll really help. Kelly, are you back?
Yes, I am. For some reason, couldn't click to unmute myself. I'm going to blame the cat that is presumably causing havoc
We
behind
love
me.
that your cats are here.
Yes. I am Kelly Shortridge. If you don't know, you can probably see a sign that says chaos behind me. Big fan of anything around emergence and complex systems, which we will probably actually touch on a little bit today. I currently run Fastly's security product line after a history of product management roles in cybersecurity and infrastructure software. And I do like yoga. I think it's good to have some sort of non-screen hobby. I also love gardening. My rooftop is popping with bees right now. So
big fan of gardening. Big fan.
You gotta
of
have
bees.
balance. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here and sharing your wealth of expertise with everyone who's here. Before we get started, just given that it's in the name of the webinar, I understand that this is an audience that probably understands, but just to level set, I want to make sure we all know what we're talking about when we say shift left. So for anyone who's unaware, shifting left in the context of DevSecOps means bringing testing and security earlier in the app development process. So specifically, when it comes to security, it describes embedding your security practices and your security testing earlier on in your app development phase. So you can identify vulnerabilities as they're being developed earlier in the testing phase to reduce the risk of something vulnerable or a breach happening in your apps after they've already been delivered or as you're further down the development cycle. We sometimes think about this as the old way of doing things where code gets written, software gets built, and then security testing happens at the very end. It's the final stage gate, which creates a lot of pressure on both sides. Developers often have to work until the very last minute to get their releases done, and the security team is left with very little time to actually ensure that the code is really secure. And if there are vulnerabilities that are discovered in this later stage, then it can delay the release, or the development team has to work nights to try to fix it in time to correct things, or maybe has to dive into things that they weren't expecting to. This is expensive, it's frustrating, and also has a lot of potential to introduce vulnerabilities. So as part of this movement to shift left was a way for organizations to make security an earlier and more integrated part of the development process, to give developers the ability to do some of the security work themselves without having to be security experts. In theory, it helps them solve all these problems by reducing the number of security concerns and making it easier for them to do security. But I think we all know that there are concepts that come out that promise to change everything and promise to fix these kind of long-standing issues. And they're kind of in a fantasy realm. And then there's the reality where things don't work. So that was the genesis of this webinar idea, that shifting left was not a bad idea, but it didn't work. And we're here to kind of explore why it didn't work and what could have made it work, and how we might re-envision the idea of shifting left going forward. So for starters, I'd like to pose to either of you, whether it's Kelly or Anna. I can start with Kelly or Anna, you can choose. What do you think went wrong? Why do you think shift left failed?
Oh yeah, I mean, I would love to hear Anna's perspective after this, boots on the ground, so to speak, because I know she's lived some of this. But I think there are a few reasons that it failed, but I think ultimately it boils down into a fundamental misunderstanding of how software is built and delivered. I think a lot of the initial conception was like, well, all the stuff we do at the end, what if we just did it earlier? That will fix things, right? What happened in practice is it wasn't quite, lending expertise during the design phase, because it turns out they didn't have the expertise required. Many times the security teams didn't have the expertise required to build in security by design, for instance. A lot of times they would sit in on design reviews, not always understand what was being discussed, just because they didn't have that software knowledge and expertise. They didn't have that context. That adds scheduling friction, and then they would ask for checkpoints along the way. They would insert their own tooling that would be outside of developer workflows, just added a lot of gates and friction to the process. And frankly, when I talk to technology leaders, like on the software side or platform engineering side, what they feel like is it was a lot of busy work, that from their perspective, it was the security team kind of shunting responsibility, saying, well, I give up on the software security stuff. If you're so good at this stuff, then you figure it out, which of course they had a right to feel like that was deeply unfair, in the sense that it was focusing more on security theater rather than the actual outcomes of, okay, when this software is running in production and facing the public internet, how do we make sure the business is okay? Even though cyber attackers will try to compromise it. It felt like it was increasingly more about the theater of shifting left, doing all these vulnerability scans. One friend shared an example of how, I'll try to keep it relatively anonymous, but in a system where, there's critical vulnerability found and they had to upgrade immediately to this new version. Well, things started breaking after they upgraded because there was a new bug introduced by this version. And because it was so new, they hadn't really had the chance to test it. And the other vulnerability, the security vulnerability that triggered it, it was going to be very hard for an attacker to actually use that to compromise, the workload in the wild. And so I think there's that lack of balance. I think there's the lack of expertise to really be true advisors to software engineering teams. And I think, unfortunately, the reality of a lot of workplaces is a lot of moves are more about centers of power than getting the right outcome.
That's interesting.
Yeah, a lot of that definitely echoes the experience I had. And one thing I would add to that is that it also kind of served as a cost saving measure in the worst case implementation too, where you add more to devs plates up front, thinking that, oh, we're going to get things to production faster. They're just going to take this on. They're going to implement it alongside all of the other development work that they're doing. But what happens in reality is you've added another thing to the same group of people's plates without giving them adequate time and resources to understand this new responsibility that they have and build all of the necessary like tooling and infrastructure that they need to better incorporate it into their process. Because bringing security in earlier is not necessarily like the same set of processes that it is on, when you're in the deployment phase or in the production phase of the software development lifecycle. It's, you're looking at different things. There are different resources available to you, and there are different ways that you get work done. And so without having that big upfront investment to really shift the team toward this new possibility of having security earlier on and security by design, you kind of just say, okay, now do this. And then like what happens after that? Well, I think in a lot of cases, like people get burnt out. You have not all of the necessary tooling that you need to get the job done. So you end up cutting corners. And you don't really solve the problem that you had in general, which is like maybe it was the delay to production, or maybe it was the lack of visibility over security over the deployment in the first place. So I think, there needed to be more time and room in a lot of cases for certain examples of shift left in reality.
Yeah, no, your comment on burnout, I think that's a really important point to put a point on it finally, because burnout is such a strong topic on the security side, mostly in the context of, having to deal with incidents. What's interesting, I think burnout is so often like both this pressure, but also struggling to find meaning and feeling that sense of satisfaction in your work. And I feel like that's a really good point about shift left. What I heard a lot of the time is it was just giving earlier reasons and more gates again for the security team to say no. Just more opportunities for them to like kind of wield the block hammer, so to speak, and be that proverbial department of no, which is really demoralizing if you are a software engineer, especially to your point, like most security training stuff. I've sat through how many trainings in my lifetime, security and otherwise, and like you try to retain it, but developers have to also care about thousands of other things in the course of their work, things like scalability and other facets of quality. And so yeah, it does seem like a recipe for burnout for sure.
And there's
Yeah,
also,
and that's sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
There's also just a significant intellectual and cognitive burden involved in context switching. So if someone is being pulled out of the workflows or the tasks that they're typically doing, or the things that they typically need to worry about and be concerned about, and now they're having something completely different, a domain that they don't have as much expertise in, that's being added and now being prioritized, sometimes against their will, as you said, and they don't necessarily understand the meaning or the critical nature of the work, that can be even more disruptive, and it has kind of a cascading effect.
Yeah, 100%. As soon as also processes change or their larger company changes, that's like breeding ground for incidents too, because people get tired, stuff gets missed. People have to context switch too much, as you mentioned, and then your attention span is like a bucket. Some people's buckets are bigger than others, but like ultimately, as you add more things in, some stuff is going to overflow out. And so, in when people are really burnt out, it's a leaky bucket. So, the more you can keep people focused and on the things that they're particularly expert in, and automate things around them that create better support for those people to consider all the possibilities, the better off you'll be.
For sure. Did you experience anything, Anna, when you were kind of in the trenches, so to speak, where you were attempting to implement a shift left and encountered some friction? Like, is there an example you can share of some type of experience, maybe related to the context switching or the having to change gears? Is it something that you experienced in your times?
Yeah, for sure. I think for us, it was very difficult to emulate production systems for a long time due to like the nature of our infrastructure in past jobs that I've had. And so sometimes when we talk about shift left, we weren't even able to start to think about shifting everything left in terms of like all of the design checks that you would need to do, because things like integration testing just like weren't all that useful or weren't all that possible without the ability to like fully mirror our production system or replay certain aspects of traffic in our production system at a development phase. So for us, that notion of shift left was never going to be complete because there were certain aspects of design and like the reality of how users would interact with the system that just weren't like possible to even think about until we had like the production proof.
And Kelly, I know you've spoken a lot in the past about security just being one more flavor of resilience, and that
Well,
resonates.
yeah, Anna actually made me think about the fact that I pretty vehemently in my book about software resilience emphatically state that as a security leader, you should be zealously advocating for integration testing in your organization and putting your budget towards it, getting whatever buy-in you can to make it happen. Because as Anna said, it is often difficult to make integration testing successful. But when I think about some of the more important security tests, integration tests are really high up there. Um, if you aren't familiar with integration tests, like ideally you're looking at the interactions between components. That's a gross simplification, but that's ultimately the way attackers think about systems is they're trying to manipulate assumptions that you have about those interactions or find hidden assumptions in there where maybe you've overlooked like, oh, this thing can talk to this other thing, or this thing can, get data from this other component that's in the system. And so integration tests and just verifying like, yes, this is all kind of like working together as intended rather than doing the more static kind of like scan the individual components. You know, SQL injection is something that we detect with our next gen WAF, right? SQL injection on its own, you could have a secure application in a secure database in theory with some of these scans. It's actually the interaction between the two, which is SQL injection, right? And so that's why you have to be looking at those relationships. And to your point, Anna, there's so much security you could be doing to advocate for just better testing in general for higher quality software before we even get into the more niche, like security specific things.
And so what about the balance between the pressures on developer teams to deliver and on security teams to protect? Sometimes those things can be seen as being at odds with one another, and they can be adversarial. And in order to have a really successful relationship and be able to shift things left, there needs to be some understanding and some collaboration and just some empathy for the other team's challenges and shared accountabilities and shared goals and trust. Have you experienced any cases where that trust was built and leveraged and that this was successful, or is it sort of like a fundamental problem in the goals between the two different teams?
No, I think it's a perceived problem, and I think it's a byproduct of kind of the traditionalist way that security had been done. I also want to take a step back, not to overly malign anyone in the security side, because I have the fundamental view everybody goes to work trying to do a good job. They're not trying to do a bad job. One trend that's in the background here that I would be remiss not to note is the fact that security teams often are getting more and more kind of corporate IT security concerns heaped on their plate. So it made sense that they wanted to abdicate that responsibility. Software is really its own domain. It is so different than like applying MDM on like employee devices, right? Things like other compliance policies, internal data management, which is we won't even get into AI tools right now, but I know that CISOs are very concerned about that. But when you talk about like software, you have to kind of have that software engineering experience to even understand how to like sustain resilience in it, right? And so I think a lot of the trade-offs, maybe if you move quickly more in that corporate IT sphere, yeah, that's a little, risky, could result in some bad stuff happening. But on the software side, what I see, and I love learning from customers. We just had an event in London last week, and I learned from some of our customers just the really cool stuff they're doing, like building, tools and something like Slack to help them, you know, automatically if they're deploying something like Reify, like a security configuration in Terraform, right? Making it easy for their software engineering teams to just like push button, get security, which is how it should be, right? And so I do see frankly, the security leaders who seem much less stressed and sleep better at night are the ones who embrace the fact that on demand change and speed helps security, right?
Mhm.
Because it means you can patch faster, you can react to attackers faster, you can push out new detections faster in a very automated way. And I think that's the healthy way of doing things. It's going to take some time, I think, to evolve that more traditional mindset for them to see, like, no, it's not actually scary. They're big organizations, Fortune 500s, other huge international companies that are doing this quite successfully.
That's really great that you've been able to get specific feedback from our customers that they've been successful in this, and it almost serves as a proof point that this isn't just a conceptual model. This is something that's actively happening in production today, and it is a model that can be replicated successfully in organizations that are prepared to think about things a little bit differently.
And I think the distinction here, and maybe this gets into how shift left might have done better, is it probably should be more of a shift like underneath, as I say, or shift down. As Camille Fournier, who wrote the book on platform engineering recently, says, it's more about building security as a platform.
Mhm.
And so in that design stage, thinking about things like modularity, thinking about what are the kind of architectural principles that early on we can build into this that maybe also have performance benefits or stability, reliability benefits that are in there. That's so important. Things like privilege design, making sure you're minimizing those, because I joke it's like a dev oops rather than a dev ops. If you have some sort of configuration management error, it turns out things like privileges, having time-based access, there are other things that can help those accidents as well. And so that's where I think really treating security as another form of platform engineering. I call it like platform resilience engineering. Doing it is like, how can we build that kind of like automation, tap into those same kind of approaches that platform engineering teams are taking and applying it to security. That is what I see where customers are successful. It's not shifting left, it's really building that tooling underneath to make it easy for software developers to succeed with security.
100%. Anna, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, 100%. One of like the best boss I had ever had while I was still a software engineer. No, sorry, making that distinction because you're an awesome
Yeah,
boss.
please. Yeah.
Greg Scallon, who's still the CTO at Flipboard, always used to say, and we practically got this tattooed on ourselves, automate yourself out of a job at every opportunity. The more you can build stuff up, and I like that, shift under rather than shift left assertion. Like the more you can automate these things into your platform, the more that you build them into the actual process versus tacking stuff onto the process, the better off you're going to be. So anytime we see an additional hoop that we have to jump through to get the same amount of work done, like there's going to be resistance to that just at a baseline. But when it's built into the process, when that's part of the golden path, so to speak, then that is usually going to yield a better outcome, and it can be iterated on too. Like there can be a feedback loop of like, this worked, this didn't work, this could be better automated. We saw this result, but really we need to have this result. And when you can have more of those conversations in addition to better like observability over the process, better monitoring of the process, and better like documentation of the process that's available to everyone, the better off you're going to be. I think a lot of times like security teams, like you mentioned before, like don't have software knowledge. Software developers don't have security knowledge necessarily. I think everyone has like a baseline of either one, but not like the deep knowledge or the context in which those things play out. And so I think that culture of like more visibility is really helpful to that end. It fosters the collaboration that's needed to build those golden paths together.
Anna, do you want to explain what golden paths are? Because I know from experience on the security side, sometimes they aren't familiar with that concept.
I am not familiar with the golden path.
For sure, I can give some background. So in platform engineering, the golden path, that taking a step back, platform engineers, like our ultimate goal is to build something that can then be used by developers to get their stuff out really quickly, right? So we want to build infrastructure, we want to build configurations, we want to build monitoring and deployment strategies that are standardized and really easy to use, so that all app developers have to go through is like a very standardized, documented and like a process that always goes according to plan. And so the golden path is what that is, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately you want both the easiest path, the path of least resistance, and the best path to be all the same thing. And so when we talk about golden paths, that's what we're talking about. And it's not necessarily just like routes to deployment, it's routes to do anything that is like the desired process.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
No, I appreciate that context. I mean, I'm one of those people who comes from a corporate IT background, what Kelly was describing before, that like security can sometimes, it can be so all encompassing because it's everything from, people and processes and platforms and governance and, InfoSec and network sec. And like, there are just so many components to running a good corporate IT program that I can completely understand and empathize with the idea of let the devs do what they do best and let them handle security. It's not even necessarily a we don't want to deal with this. It's a we don't feel capable of dealing with this. Let's let them be the experts in their own platform and sort of empower them to design their platform in a way, as you said, like security as a platform, secure by design, to say, we trust you to deliver the golden path for your particular set of use cases for your own internal teams. And let's just let you do that. And let's try to give you as much leeway and runway as possible to design what works best for you so you can stay in that flow state.
I think what you described is exactly the healthy approach. I think in practice, I've seen the much unhealthier version of that, which is, maybe not, and I understand like not wanting to admit that they don't necessarily have the software engineering expertise. I think that can be intimidating for sure when software is eating the world. And then if you don't have that expertise, then like, oh no, what's my role in this world? And I would argue, to your point, corporate IT is going to be around forever. So you absolutely have a role. I think what's unfortunately often in practice under the guise of shift left is that, well, you're going to deal with it, but also we're going to dictate exactly what you do and how that looks. And that's where it gets really unhealthy. But I think to your point, yes, it's figuring out, how do we make sure that the golden path Anna described is the one that has like auditing on it? Because that's important for compliance. How do we make sure with the golden path like we have we're tracking, security configuration changes in Git, just like everything else we do. It's little things like that that are maybe not as big and flashy as buying, some super cool tool, getting cool swag, but it's like those little things add up into quite a like robust and comprehensive program. I think that's something again I love seeing from customers and certainly companies outside of our customer base as well. Thinking of one CISO who I remember I saw him and he just seemed like way more chill and at ease than when I'd last seen him. He's like, yeah, I'm just letting people deploy onto serverless. So as a disclaimer, Fastly does offer a compute platform, which very much aligns with this. But the idea is like, yeah, they can write like, I don't know if we're allowed to swear. I will clean up what he said. They can write very crappy code. And if it's on this runtime, which serverless runtimes are, that's at least in our case, that's immutable and ephemeral. So that means like it can't change once it's deployed and it only lives for a little bit for its task and then it dies. Even if there is a vulnerability, the attacker's going to have a really hard time exploiting in the first place. And even if they do, they're going to have to do it again and again and again, probably in a matter of seconds in many cases. So it's just like, just tell the software engineering teams, if you deploy it that way, then you don't have to go through all these checks. You're fine.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really healthy way of, again, staying outcomes focused. Like the outcome is we want to raise the cost of attack and then minimize the impact if it does happen. And so there are ways to achieve that that can be, like you said, abdicating control. I think there is just a psychological thing around like letting software engineers write crappy code that can feel a little like, oh, that shouldn't be happening. But ultimately, it's about what's best for the business.
Yeah. And conceptually, it's not that different from a corporate IT perspective from browser isolation of having like a blast radius that you can control and give someone the freedom and the flexibility to do whatever it is that they need to do in order to experiment and feel free and safe to do things that could potentially lead to catastrophic failure. But if you have created an environment in which you can detonate safely from a distance, you're in good hands. So that's obviously one approach that you can take in choosing your infrastructure or choosing a platform to run your infrastructure on. Thinking about those components of I know you mentioned like isolation and privilege design, but also just like memory safety and other types of like foundational components of a development environment that you can use then to promote that sense of trust in your safety and your ability to protect your organization from anything that might go awry and maintain resilience.
Yeah, I think to add to that too, I think that's a huge part of noise reduction too, because like a lot of noise that is generated by like having concerns that aren't particularly prioritized are, that leads to developer burnout, that leads to friction between teams, that leads to people wasting their time on something when they could be focused on something that delivers more value or is more impactful from a security perspective. So I think the more we can build things into the platform that allow us to reduce that noise or to reassert like what our actual priorities should be, the better. And so, like the memory safety is like a huge example. Picking a tool that has that built in, building more things that are able to connect to like your CI/CD pipeline, so that you're not like having to do all these manual things during development or during production, means that that will be part of the golden path because it's just easier. And then ideally within the outputs of those things, like the most important things that developers need to be focused on are raised higher than anything that's not particularly relevant to the actual purpose of the deployment, if that makes sense. So, the more that you can kind of narrow down on what those things are and connect them to like business outcomes or customer outcomes, the better.
I think that's a good principle for security teams as well, because another pattern I see is, security teams do take responsibility for this kind of shift left and more of these activities, but they struggle because if you try to do this manually, and I know some security teams that do, they often have 6-month backlogs, which obviously slows down the business, right? But it also doesn't feel good for them. No one wants to see a 6-month queue on their plate. And so I think a lot of the automation we're talking about, a lot of like building, shifting underneath, building these tools that make security things easier, that also benefits security teams in a way I think sometimes they don't appreciate until it's there. The number of times I've seen security leaders claim, well, this isn't possible, and if only this, and then one of their peers is like, well, we actually do that, and here's how we do it, and you can see they get excited because the idea that their teams are going to have more capacity and be able to work on higher value work, which I think is part of your point, is like we should be freeing up, the beauty of human creativity and problem solving for the things that require a lot of thinky and not like, how to make sure, to your point, like we're wrapping everything in like a memory safe membrane or something like that, or
Right.
even simpler. One of my favorite demos I built with our next gen WAF was automatically pulling in an IP block list daily. That's just a GitHub action that does that. And that kicks off like a configuration change that's pushed to GitHub, automatically accept that PR, which goes out to Terraform, and then it updates the next gen WAF. And it takes, I don't know, in the background, like a couple minutes maybe at most. But I could be just, drinking my matcha on my rooftop and I wouldn't know. It just happens. And imagining having to like pull that list manually and do all of that, it's really painful. And instead, it's like I get to ponder like big, deep thoughts or something, right? And I think that's what everybody wants, is just like, how do we remove some of the TDM, or toil is the common term in platform engineering land. And platform engineering, I think, can make that a lot easier.
I really like that you call out creativity in particular as something that, I don't want to speak for developers and security professionals, but like it's not something that often gets discussed. Although I think it is really important that, going back to the idea of your work being valuable and having meaning, and that's what motivates you. How do you see creativity potentially playing a role in how you come up with solutions for these challenges? Like, do you think that there are ways? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go.
Yeah, no. I'm so excited about this because I think creativity is so underrated, especially in defense. When I've talked to cyber attackers over the years, they are often creative people. Some are just kind of like doing their job like everybody, but a lot are very creative and they like the challenge. They like, some sense, like the elegance a lot of times in kernel exploitation language we don't have to get into. But I think there's almost been this resignation sometimes in cybersecurity that defense is just like hard and sludgy, and like you have to kind of like march your way through the muck. It's like, no, it can be fun and playful and whimsical. Like, we're very big fans of like a deception approach. You're going to see more from us as a company about that quite soon. I personally have been a fan of, as I lovingly say, gaslighting attackers over the years. And I think there are other creative ways, again, like thinking about, hey, how do we implement secure by design? Is there a way to introduce more modularity? Maybe if we use things like queues, that's something that can buy us a little time if we have to patch. And that's also something we want for performance reasons. It's like thinking bigger, and getting creative, and specifically getting into like creative collaboration with other people who have different perspectives. I feel like that's so powerful and underrated, and it's just great where at the end of the day you can look at your colleagues and be like, wow, we figured out something pretty cool. And I think that's when I talk to some more traditionalist security leaders, that is such a just mind shift in a way from the old way of just like, no, like they're kind of our enemies. Sometimes they talk about them kind of like enemies more than attackers are the enemy, which is a little not ideal. It's like instead it's like, no, we're like friends who are
Yeah.
working
Well, that's
together
that's
to
the
like,
mental model in security.
yeah,
It's like it's good guys, bad guys, or just, you know, this mentality that
exactly.
we have a perimeter to protect. That's what we
Yeah.
do. And so you apply that mentality to every interaction that you have.
Right, which is not healthy for the person applying that mental model either. And so that's where I think, encouraging that this is a viable path and you will feel better too. And you will like your work more probably and feel more fulfilled by it. I feel like that's often an under-emphasized point.
Yeah, for sure. I think the more you can get the like repetitive support piece off your plate, the more that you have like a brain that is even capable of starting to think about some of those creative solutions. I know, like, one facet of a job that I used to do was like dealing with attackers kind of at the edge level or at the load balancer level, and doing the kind of drudgery of playing whack-a-mole with like IP block lists or some other like regex solution that would ultimately like yield a false positive. And what I really needed was like the ability to better address some of those problems, whether that was like the knowledge or the resources, in order to free myself up to think of that work at like a more creative level. So addressing the problem in the minute would have freed me up to do things like, figure out, you're talking about deception, figure out how to like make cyber attackers' lives a lot harder so that this game of whack-a-mole is no longer valuable to them. And thinking about like also how to kind of get back at them for that time that was wasted on my part too. How can I put them in Pan's Labyrinth? So the more you can automate the drudgery away, the better off you can be to start to think about like a higher level of problems.
So moving back to that idea of shifting under and automation, all these ways that you can make this seamless and essentially effortless for the teams that are actually solving the problems and building creative solutions to business problems, not just security problems, but building and shipping the code that actually powers the business. In a perfect world, because now since we're in the world of fantasy, how would you design, or are there any like actionable things that you can recommend for someone who's fully bought into this idea but has no idea where to start? Maybe their organization is struggling with these challenges, or they just haven't felt like they've been able to make the headway that they need in terms of like making this reality. What might you recommend?
If you're a security leader, I suggest finding whoever is closest to the platform engineering leader. It might be, under the name infrastructure ops or even just, software engineering, and just asking them like, what are some of the software quality problems you have? Like
Mm,
getting them to talk about like, hey, here's where we're struggling, like with integration testing, if that's not in place. They have lots of outages, or, you know, they aren't getting the performance or like efficiency they expect. Like really deeply listen to them. And then I think approach the conversation is like, okay, how can we tackle some of those? Like basically combine our shared budget, our shared kind of like ability to make change in the organization and tackle some security problems at the same time. I think it starts with listening though to find where are the commonalities. Again, maybe it's lack of things like integration testing, or maybe it's that you don't have good like logs when you need them.
mhm.
Um, you've got like a clunky alerting pipeline, whatever it is. But like listen and find the common ground is what I advise a lot of leaders to do in the first place. If you're more at the engineer level, there's some books I would certainly recommend, including I mentioned Camille Fournier's book. Of course, I would recommend mine because I actually wrote it kind of to bridge both sides towards this more like resilience approach. But I think if you're a platform engineer, it's certainly understanding a bit better. I mean, I personally think most platform engineers can get quite devious if whenever I ask them like, hey, how would you make life miserable for yourself if you were, I don't know, mad at your company and you were trying to do something nefarious in the system, and normally they can brainstorm some interesting things. And on the security engineering side, I would say, hey, just try to automate like one thing, like get Terraform, just figure out one thing maybe you can automate, and then find another engineer, again, on more the software engineering side, platform engineering side, see what they've built, and maybe you can start brainstorming together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like collaboration piece has to come first. Like you have to build those relationships so that you can like depend on one another and make sure that you maintain your alignment through like that process of change, and so that that change doesn't land as hard on the people that it affects as well. I think for us, like things that worked for us when I was in engineering started with like a culture of visibility. So whether that was with monitoring or just like tracing or like any sort of mechanism that could bring greater visibility into the system at all parts of its life cycle, as well as like fostering a culture of documentation as well, so that people aren't left out by like any background knowledge that they're missing, or by particular processes that seem to operate in a black box otherwise because they're not documented. And so the more that you build both of these things, the more you can have empathy for one another and have an understanding of like the challenges and the different like business activities that each group is doing, and like what they value and what they don't value. And you can better align like what you're trying to build together. I think at a baseline, so much of that can be automated too, so it does serve that like shift under purpose and not add additional burden to people. If you can build some kind of automation of documentation through the development process, that helps a lot. If you can build tracing into your code base, and that way you can automatically generate like the diagrams and graphs that you need to demonstrate how a system works without having to have an engineer like draw it on a whiteboard every single time. So those are some of the things that kind of worked for us to unite those two parts of the puzzle together.
And I guess the last piece too is like, once you've fostered and built that better relationship and that better sense of collaboration between platform engineering and security, then tying it all back to business outcomes and being able to say, now that we've kind of gotten ourselves into this motion where we are collaborating more effectively, we are now then able to deliver better applications and more resilient applications and better customer experiences, and ultimately more revenue for the businesses that employ us and keep us happy. So there's that extra level of advocacy, not just for your own team, but for the interplay between security and platform engineering and delivery. And innovation velocity is something we talk about a lot too, is the ability to deliver things faster, respond to market conditions more effectively, and advocate for all these things while also doing all these things. So it's a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it always has to tie back to business outcomes. Security for its own sake, like just go to academia. You're going to be happier there, but ultimately it's like it's a business. And sometimes I think basically no matter your role, it's going to be true whether you're a CISO or a CFO or CTO. Sometimes you're not going to agree with the decisions your peers make. Your job is to like help guide decision making, for sure. In some case, you are the decision maker. Sometimes you're an advisor, and sometimes the decision isn't what you advised, but you have to, it's the disagree and commit kind of philosophy, and you can't just dig in your heels. You have to find like a viable path forward at that point. And so I think, again, I see a lot of security leaders that are getting to that healthy place. I also noticed in the chat, I'm going to disagree with one of our awesome viewers, but I love this because I love being able to bring this up, because a lot of people do say things like, yeah, just bring ethical hackers into the product team. I have not seen that work very much in practice. That's something I actually advocated for back in the day. Back when I wrote like a slimmer, it's called a report. I won't go into too much detail, but then when I followed up with some of those companies, it hadn't really worked in practice. Now, what did start to work is getting platform engineers to kind of naturally include, whether it's in kind of decision tree threat models or their overall kind of like, they do perform analysis of like, here are roughly the things that could go wrong. Like what happens if our log pipelines suddenly break? Like, how are we going to know that something's going wrong? It's more of that anticipating what could go wrong and how, again, to minimize the impact. It's like getting them to then think about security through the same lens, and again, finding that common ground. Again, I can't stress enough, platform engineers I have found to often be more devious than ethical hackers. They also understand the systems better, which is not unlike how a lot of attackers will deeply research their target systems. I've just had, in some sense, more success in doing threat modeling exercises, like consulting engagements with exclusively software engineering and platform engineering teams than I have sometimes with security teams. because I think it's such a break from their typical day to day. And maybe Anna, you have thoughts on this, that they really relish the opportunity to think about like, oh yeah, okay, if I could be evil for a little bit,
I mean, that
what would
speaks
I
to
do? Yeah,
that speaks to the creativity piece, right? Like when
right.
you get away from the drudgery of your job, like suddenly you have all these ideas. Like that's how the human brain likes to work, right? Like we want novelty, and I think your point, like if you know the systems really thoroughly, then you might have an idea of like where the problems are. I think that context is really important. Especially like what I said earlier about like, oh, I don't have integration testing, so sometimes when you're developing this interconnectivity between these two different systems, like, well, I think it works, but like that's definitely where I would start, because I don't have any like assurance necessarily until
Exactly.
things go out into production that what I think is actually what's happening. So yeah, I think for sure that resonates with me.
No, and keep the questions coming too. I think we've reached the end of our prepared time to chat, but like we can absolutely keep talking as much as we like. So like if anyone who's listening has any questions for us, feel free to pop them in the Q&A panel. You can also just use the chat function, and we're happy to hang out for a bit and interact with you. But I guess just in terms of like, if we wanted to wrap up this conversation, what's one thing you would like to see going forward as a whole within platform engineering, or within the collaboration between platform engineering and security, that if you could advocate for, whether within the organization that we work in or within the organizations that you work with, what's like the one thing that you think everyone should start with, or what's your one critical piece that you think is most important?
Keep the corporate IT security and software security separate. I think that is kind of the silo that you do need. And then with the software security side, treat it more like resilience, where cyber attacks are just one flavor of failure that can happen. And so in the kind of spectrum of failures that can occur in your systems, treat them kind of the same, like approach the problem in the same way, which will be largely a platform engineering approach of trying to build in that resilience by design, than otherwise like layer on different ways to minimize the impact of it. But I think it's I think humility and, in some sense, like respect for the problem domain. It is requires a completely different set of skills and mental models to secure software than secure corporate IT.
Yeah, and to that same vein, I would love to advocate, from our point of view as like a company that's developing tools for developers, would love to see more alignment with considering the platform engineering folks out there and the problems that they have with our messaging, so that they know what tools they have to make their lives easier too. Like industry wide, I think, there's the older, kind of traditional corporate security notion, and then there's like the more modern, kind of more hybrid and more collaborative versions of that. So the more we can get that message out, the more we can advocate for automating more of that in the process, and not treating security as like a special sub case of, like you mentioned, like all the other types of testing and compliance you do. The better off you'll be.
There was a comment actually earlier in the session that someone said that it seems like any way you slice it, it's really about budget and resources at the end of the day. Isn't that the truth? I love that we're in, this creative space where we can talk about best potential, but given the real time and budget restrictions that so many organizations have, like, is there a way to adequately balance the realities of living in the world that perhaps have been prompting some of these problems to start? Like maybe Shift Left failed not because conceptually it was wrong, but because there were some other mitigating factors in play. So just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
To speak to that, there's a saying in like project management, when I was like learning like to become a product manager, that you can do things like cheaply, well, or quickly, right? Pick two. You can't do all three. And I think that kind of is a guiding principle also for engineering leaders as they think about like how to incorporate things into their process as well. So it's not just about like projects that see your end users. It's about internal projects as well. And so I think when we approach the problem as like, oh, we have to change everything, we have to shift everything left, that's like not a super healthy way to look at it. You need to do like incremental changes, and that makes things more manageable. That makes things like more able to be prioritized. And especially if that priority order is in line with like what your risk factors are or like what your business outcomes should be. So, that is, I think, kind of one way to look at the problem. I think like that's like also one of the things that like stalls shift left too. People get kind of overwhelmed by the whole problem or the whole notion that they need to change everything they do. And it can be a whole lot simpler than that.
I also saw that there was a question about, would any of the recommendations change, or would you adjust or have anything else to say for non-product teams? Resilience obviously matters for more than just products. Things like service delivery, things like real-time types of systems that aren't necessarily around product, but are around other core aspects of business function.
Yeah, I think the more that they can integrate or understand and integrate themselves into the process, the better. So, when you had mentioned things like compliance or something like that, like having that be part of the software engineering process, if you can have a way to have like configuration or testing for that built in and automated into like a CI/CD pipeline, for example, like that will help get the job done, but everyone will be kind of speaking that same language, and you're not adding additional friction because it's just another thing that plugs into the matrix of how things already work.
Makes sense to me.
I also saw a great question, which is following CIS recommendations. I'll be careful so I don't make the CIS people unhappy, but I think benchmarks and I think kind of compliance standards in general. And I'm not a checklist hater. I should make that clear. There's pretty good research in behavioral science that checklists can help. But I think ultimately the CIS benchmarks, again, it comes from a very distinctly cybersecurity perspective. It's very, again, static components, like, what's the secure configuration for this thing? And the reality of, again, I would argue corporate IT is like this, but I think software systems are much more like this, is they're dynamic, living, breathing systems. And so pretending like there's any one way that will work forever, I think is not great. I think checklists can get stale. I think you should automate those checklists wherever you can. So certainly like CS benchmarks, like maybe they can help you. I would say it's like one input that you can have, but it certainly shouldn't be the only. And again, I think in some sense it's healthier to start with, well, what if we thought even bigger beyond the checklist and we started to think about, again, infusing more of those fundamental by design principles that might benefit our system in other dimensions like performance or scale. I think thinking about that is much healthier. And also platform engineers are probably not going to have the capacity to read through the CIS benchmarks. There are a lot of them. So some don't apply, but yeah.
Checklists and benchmarks are useful and they absolutely have their place, but like treating them as the end point rather than the beginning point, I can see that being a potential pitfall.
Yeah, and kind of straddling both worlds. It's interesting that you just don't see the equivalent really on the platform engineering side. Security is much more of the, get a certification. I mean, there's some certifications in platform, but it's like get a certification, like, take these like courses that teach you, here's the correct way to do the thing. Because I feel like in platform engineering, by necessity, you learn very quickly there is no one right way to do things. It's entirely contextual.
Do we have any closing words of wisdom?
And I'll let you go first.
I think ultimately, I think the takeaway I want to have is that I think, every organization is in a different place with like how they do certain things, what their outcomes need to be. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, it's really important that we have all the functions of the company collaborate as much as possible, particularly within the security space. I think we ultimately all want good outcomes and we want good business value outcomes. We want to make money. We want to do a good job at our jobs. as Kelly mentioned. And so the more that we can think about the process as a delivery mechanism for doing a good job, I think the more we'll be able to foster alignment between the teams, and the more we'll be able to reduce some of the friction to the delivery process that maybe we experience in the current world, or even in like the problems with the shift left world as well. And, you know, I hate to keep saying like automate yourself out of a job, but the more, you know, you build into that process, the less there is to argue about and the less there is to be mad about. So.
Yeah, I like that. I think as succinctly as possible, I would say like try to shift underneath together. Don't impose it. Really collaborate and build the platforms, tools, the golden paths that your organization needs to make security as invisible as possible, whether that's to, you know, app developers, other platform engineering teams, you know, even service providers that have their own tooling that they're building, right? You know, if there's software involved, just figure out how to make kind of the everything that's underneath the logic that they're building as secure as possible without them having to be experts and adding friction to their workflows.
Well, I, for one, am always incredibly grateful to get to spend time with both of you because I always learn so much as someone who's relatively new to the application security space relative to the other types of security I've been focused on. I feel like I've been a really good proxy for your corporate IT folks who don't really know exactly what's going on. So appreciate that. But thank you so much for your time and for your dedication and for caring so much about this topic. Really, really enjoyed getting to hear from both of you. And with that, I would really like to just, you know, once again, thank everyone for participating and being engaged and asking
I want to
questions.
say one thing because
Sure.
one of our awesome listeners just said something great. So I want to read it.
Go for it, Kelly.
It's
Go
like,
for it.
I guess the wisdom is forget left or right. Yes.
Forget left or right.
Focus on what works in your organization, culture, and environment. Keep experimenting, learning, implementing, and adjusting. Beautifully put. I just
What a
want to shout that out.
great
Here,
quote. Just
here.
put that on a
Right.
shirt.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Forget left or right.
Yeah.
And with that, I guess we can pass it back to Jared if you want to bring us home.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Lorraine, Kelly, and Anna. This was an amazing discussion. I loved all the comments that were coming in too, all the questions. Thank you for taking the time to join us. It has been a pleasure having you. And for everyone else that joined, we want to thank you for joining this TechStrong learning experience. Before we do close out, though, I want to remind everyone that there is a survey in the resource section. If you could give us your input, it is invaluable to us. It helps the Fastly team. It helps me here at TechStrong for what you guys want to hear on the next program or just what we need to do to improve. Once again, this program is recorded. You will receive an email in your inbox shortly. And if you haven't downloaded the links to any of the handouts, go ahead and do that real quick. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Thank you. Appreciate it.